this opportunity to talk to my thesis, which is on crisis stewards taking action in crisis. It's a grounded theory and it focused on the Australian public sector executives, which I'll explain in a minute. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Helen Scott as my supervisor, and also for the feedback that I received from each of the examiners, which was really helpful, and I've incorporated in my revised version. So just to give a bit of context, COVID-19 was a global crisis, but it did affect each country in a different way. In the Australian context, it was slightly different. It's very hard to measure the data such as death rates or the number of cases. There's currently 770 million cases because everything's measured in a different way, and WHO recognise this. But you can measure the varying ways in which people responded. So how did different countries have used masks, business decisions around maintaining the economy, social distancing, education and border control. And the focus in this particular case was in the phase, it's a time-bound piece of research in the response phase. And the picture that I put there is just an example of a difference in Australia, and that was that for a period of time during 2020, all visitors to Australia came through one single site in Darwin, and everybody went through a quarantine centre. So that was a different public health response in other countries. My research focus is particularly on leadership, and I was interested, as I started this grounded theory, in what was the impact in this type of crisis. What does crisis look like? Does it alter the style and the impact for leaders? And then most importantly for me was the public sector, because of the profile during crisis, this particular crisis, the public sector received a profile that it hadn't formally had in crisis. It has it in strategy and policy, but not for this type of event. And the media had a big role to play, as did the political interest, and that's also pointed out by Boyne et al. In 2016. I wanted to contribute to the research in this area, and I was particularly interested in the concept of a theory. My scope was the Australian executive public sector. That is Tier 1 and Tier 2 of the public sector. And I haven't named them specifically in terms of roles because they're identifiable. I took the time to get consent for confidentiality, and so I was keen to ensure that anonymity, and I was keen to ensure that I did that. I am also, at that time, I was a Tier 1 executive, and that means someone who reports directly to a Minister of Government or has an influence with the Minister of Government as a Tier 2 leader. I chose classic grounded theory for a range of reasons, but partly because it is often used in health and human services, and my background was that. I come from a background of a nurse originally, 20 years as an executive, and 40 years in health. And at the time of this research, I was working in health. The conceptual nature was also appealing to me. I was interested in developing theory. And there is a query about whether or not COVID is a new phenomenon. Is it a new type of crisis? But I think the language and the narrative in the public was certainly that it was something, a 1 in 100 year of crisis. It affected everyone globally and it affected everyone personally. And so it was a different kind of phenomenon, a new normal. Data collection resulted was across high-profile Tier 1 and Tier 2 leaders, and I was in a privileged position to be able to ask them questions and seek their trusted information because of the fact of their high-profile nature. We're talking Chief Health Officers, Police Commissioners, those kinds of roles. I also undertook, because of COVID, face-to-face and virtual interviews. Face-to-face was really helpful because I could observe the tone, the nuance of individual people, but virtual interviews provided a level of distance and a level of anonymity so people could be honest, and so it was valuable in its own way. Data analysis was undertaken, and I undertook theoretical memoing, which is one of the tenets of classic grounded theory, and the main concern emerged as burden of stewardship. And an example here from one of the participants was that they felt the weight of leading their agency and also more broadly. Interestingly, the core category was both the means of resolving the main concern and was the core category, and that was about taking action, beyond decision making but to taking action. Concepts such as the combined force and power to act also emerged, and as one participant said, the media role really challenged was a challenge on behalf of the public, but it also affected how decisions were made. And in Australia, the media decided that AstraZeneca was an unsafe vaccine for us to use, and as a result, the public sector made a decision to step away from it. And that's just one example of where it was, and was reflected on in the data. I also used methodological memos, which Dr. Scott suggested, and for me that was a really useful way as a novice researcher of learning how to undertake the research. I really enjoyed that part of it because I reflected on my own experience. It gave me the opportunity to set aside my own thoughts and to write down how I was actually learning to be a novice researcher and what I built on. I also then took on theoretical coding, and one of the unexpected areas that emerged out of the data was that this concept of combined fields, which is both a concept in grounded theory, but it's also, I would contend, is now the potential to be a theoretical code, where the combination and the integration of the 6 theoretical codes that exist in Glazer's 6 Cs also has the potential to have a 7th for integration. So the grounded theory, I like a bold picture. So the grounded theory itself is crisis stewards taking action in crisis. And that is made up of fundamentally how the crisis stewards resolve this weight of stewardship, the feeling of burden of crisis stewardship. And they do that by taking action. And they take action because they have a role as a crisis steward. They've been given that role in some form. Because there's an imminent threat of crisis, and in this case it was an unpredictable and persistent crisis, and then they have at varying degrees of impact based on the conditions under which this exists. So powers to act include formal powers to act, which is the legislation under which the public sector works, and it's the informal powers to act, which may be the public discourse, the media component, and also the organisational structures in which they work. In the public sector, hierarchical and matrix structures are predominant, and the data itself came from the public sector, and so that was reinforced in the data. The capacity to act, which is about whether a crisis steward has the behaviours, the capabilities to undertake action, include personal characteristics, their leadership attributes, and organisational culture. So to explain that in a little more detail, I've used a graph that has the scale of dimensions in the capacity to act. So these 3 areas of personal characteristics, moving between inflexibility to flexibility, being fragile, having personal circumstances, and examples in the data included that these crisis stewards have personal circumstances such as their own health conditions, which makes them less comfortable to undertake the action. And then leadership attributes. It is one of the key elements of this theory is that crisis stewards who are new to crisis need support from the organisation and the organisational team, but also they may be experienced. And there is a real variance in their confidence in making decisions and taking action between being new to crisis and being experienced. Authority or directiveness versus consultative is also a key element of capacity to act. These are obviously situational, and these crisis stewards move between them. Some are able to manage that balance more than others. It is a scale of dimensions, and I recognise that it's at both ends of that scale for each of these. But as you can imagine, the combinations and the ways in which people could actually act across all of those areas varies. It could vary over time potentially, but this is during the response phase only of a crisis. And as one leader has said as an example in the data, I became very operational and directed, nothing could be ignored. And that was the example that was given. And those elements in the capacity to act and the behaviours of crisis stewards are fundamental. So crisis stewards are made up of a combination of their capacity to act, their personal characteristics, their leadership attributes, and the organisational culture in which they work. So do they work with an agile team or a rigid team? And an example that was given to me in the data was around a mildly experienced crisis steward who worked with a strong clinical team who could not move from a policy perspective to a operational perspective. And in fact, in order for that crisis steward to be successful and have an impact, they were required to change teams. Power to act is made up of the legislation, the public discourse, as I mentioned, and organisational structures. And the imminent threat of crisis. In this case, it's COVID-19, but it could potentially be other crises of a similar nature. And because I think it's important to just sit in that moment of what it felt like, this is in Italy as the coffins were put out, and it's important to remember how we felt in that time and how much we felt we needed the imminent threat of crisis and health protection was so significant. So, the types of crisis that emerged from the data included those crisis stewards who felt that they had some of the attributes that I've mentioned in capacity to act, and they actually have stated that they were those kinds of government officials who were directing events and were seeking to control the public sector and beyond the public sector. And there were particular types of public sector leaders who did that. Strivers represent those those crisis stewards who have a different range of elements somewhere along the scale, and they are a group of CEOs or public stewards who work quickly together and can take on roles with authority and be directive, but may only be able to influence a smaller group of people. And survivors recognises those group of people who felt they needed cover for decisions. They needed policy support when they wanted to make a decision like working from home for their organisation or to work with other agencies. They don't feel confident making decisions in beyond their own organisation. And the data suggests that the types of examples that I put under survivors what that might look like. So ultimately, the impact of crisis steward as a thriver, a striver or a survivor is based on the capacities to act, plus the organisational culture, plus a persistent crisis, and all of the powers to act, whether it's the legislation, the discourse, or the structures. And they work together in a combined force, not independently but together, and will have varying degrees of impact. And the levels of impact that emerged includes societal impact, where a crisis steward is able to move beyond their own sector. For example, border control in the Australian context. We had very great legislation that said we were able to shut states. However, a crisis steward with a strong influence over government, being able to influence the legislation or use the legislation and the public discourse, was able to close borders between states in Australia for up to 2 years, so had a significant impact. When you look at a crisis steward who has a more sector impact, it is a crisis steward that might influence that sector. So in terms of, well, an example of this in the data is where a crisis steward was able to get other CEOs or public sector leaders to assist them with welfare hotlines, pull in staff from other areas and other areas of the public sector to set up welfare centres, for example, but couldn't go beyond that to influence, for example, the not-for-profit sector. And in local impact, there are examples, and in this case I'll use an example from COVID-19, where individual crisis stewards did not feel confident taking action beyond their own organisation. So they may implement, and for example, working from home policies, may implement an emergency coordination centre for their own organisation, but they couldn't do it beyond that. Can't do it beyond that. In reviewing the literature, the stewardship theory, the crisis stewards nest within stewardship theory, leadership theory and crisis management. I used Artarev for the co-citation analysis, and Donaldson and Davis is widely read and in high-quality papers, so that was the fundamental area that I looked at. It was in the Academy of Management. And Leadership and Crisis Management, both Van Wart focusing on the public sector and Boyd et al. Focusing on crisis that is persistent, and also I used, and they were both in the public administration review. So the contribution. So the contribution I feel that this theory offers is it's a new theory that's nested in the literature between three other areas, leadership, stewardship and crisis management. I have also proposed the potential for a enhanced code in the family of 6 Cs. with a seventh code that is combined force, and also the opportunity to explore further methodological memoing as a means of supporting emergent new grounded theorists to learn how to undertake this methodology. In terms of management practice contribution, there are potential predictors of success in here for public sector leaders as crisis steward that can be enhanced and may be subject potentially to further research. And there's also considering the application of emergency capability that can build the effect and the impact. Because of course, as people move through the period of time, we're talking now 18 months, 2 years, they went from being new crisis stewards to experienced. And so they're moving across the suite of crisis stewards. In terms of management contribution and the practice, there's also the potential to consider reviewing the retrospective lens that the public and politicians' actions have taken. And we have seen the emergence of inquiries all over the world, and that's a different lens for the action that's taken. So the confident crisis manager, confident crisis steward has taken significant actions, influencing government, etc., is now under the scrutiny, of course, of inquiry. So that's an opportunity to think about the future. Yeah, and Australia has just announced one. There'll be a COVID inquiry across the country. So this is happening behind the scenes. Also understanding the tactical decision making because people move to authoritative or directive styles of leadership, and how does that sit in that's sat during a response phase, what does it look like in a recovery phase? There's also, with working from home as an example, opportunity for maintaining reforms within crisis and the chance to think about that for both the impact but also future research. In terms of other future research, there's a broader application beyond the public sector and executives. I've been 40 years in the public sector and have now moved to the not-for-profit sector, and I think there's potential. There are crisis stewards, I suspect, in every senior organisation that would be an opportunity to study them. It is time-bound, so I'm interested in what this type of model looks like, this theory looks like in a recovery phase, or in business as usual, where you might have a highly contentious project, you might have a highly contentious decision to make. Can it be translated? And of course, other types of crisis that have the nature of being unpredictable and long-term. So in conclusion, this theory outlines the role of crisis stewards, their behaviours and the potential varying impact in crisis. And the theory is nested within stewardship, leadership and crisis management theory. Thank you very much.
Thank you.